In this video, we will be looking at error handling in AWS Step Functions. What happens when something goes wrong and how to recover from it. I will walk you through two key techniques: how to retry steps that fail temporarily and how to catch errors and exceptions in your workflow. By the end, you will know how to make your workflows more reliable and handle errors gracefully. Welcome back to this YouTube channel. If you're new here, my name is Rahul and I make videos on .NET, Cloud and DevOps. This video is sponsored by AWS and is part of my .NET on AWS series. Here we have the existing user onboarding workflow that we created in the previous video where we explored how to integrate with different AWS services. We used DynamoDB, SQS and Lambda in this case to build up a user onboarding workflow. Now let's look at a simple example where the Lambda function might throw an exception. Now I have slightly modified this to pass additional parameters where we are sending the source and also a retry count property which comes from states context state.retry count. We will soon see what this property means. Now I have updated the Lambda function to look at the source property and throw some exceptions. Now if the source is invalid, it throws a specific type of exception, similarly with transient, etc. Now mainly I will be using only invalid and transient for this demo. Now when it is a transient exception, you can see I have modified the code to also look at the retry count and simulate it like a transient error. So it will error for the first two times but will pass if it is a third retry. Now let's come back to our user workflow and see how the retry fits into our workflow states. Now let's select the Lambda invoke, and in the panel, if you navigate to the error handling, you can see by default this has retry on errors and it has also set up a retryer logic. Now if we edit this, you can see the properties here. Now in this case, it is looking for specific Lambda exceptions to retry if they error. Now let's run this application without adding or modifying any of these and see what happens when we have an error. So let's click execute. Let's put in our data for our user. Now in this case, I'm specifying the source as transient, which will invoke an error. So let's click start execution. Now when it hits the Lambda function, it is going into the transient flow, which is going to throw an exception. Now if you select this, you can see there is an error for this. You can see it entered the task state entered, scheduled, started and failed. Now if we expand the fail, you can see this is failed for the error type Lambda service exception. Now this is the exact same exception that I'm throwing in my code as a custom exception. So you can see this Lambda service exception is just a class that's defined in the same code. Now in this case, the workflow completely got stopped and terminated when this exception happened. However, this error might be a transient error in nature, which means it might be intermittent and get cleared itself. So you should be able to retry and it should pass on its own. So let's come and edit our state machine and navigate to the Lambda, the error configuration. Let's edit this and let's also add the Lambda service exception that we are custom throwing in our code. So let's paste that inside here, press enter, and it has added the Lambda service exception to the list. Now you can see this is also configuring a retry, which is saying an interval of 1 second, a maximum attempt of 3, and a backoff rate of 2. Now, if you want to understand the details about what each of these properties means, you can look at the documentation and see the appropriate definition for these values. So basically, the max attempts specify how many times it will be retried before giving up. The backoff rate is a retry interval. It basically increases the duration after each attempt. So you can see for a value of 3 interval seconds, max attempts 3, and backoff rate of 2, the first retry takes place after 3 seconds, the second plays after 6, and the third happens after 12. So it just introduces an artificial delay so that it's not overloading the service that is failing. So let's come back to our user onboarding workflow. With this added, let's save this again and let's trigger a new execute. Let's paste in the user object again with the source as transient and start execution. Now in this case, it's again going to hit the Lambda invoke. It is going to throw an exception the first time. You can see it's gone into the yellow state, but it has tried it multiple times. Now you can see this has tried for a couple of times and it has gone green and passed the workflow. Now if we look at the invokes, It's failed one time here with the Lambda service exception, but since we have set up a retry, it is again trying that same step. So you can see it has failed one more time, which is the second time, and you can see finally it is failed again, after which it is passing. Now, if you look at the task schedule, you can see the parameters that's being passed in. So the first time the retry count is 0, after which you can see again task schedule gets sent with an increased retry count, which is the second, so I've missed one in the middle. But you can see the final task schedule has the retry count of 3, for which your application is looking at the value retry count, and if it is greater than 3, it is not throwing an exception. So in that specific case, what happens is it succeeds the invocation and ends the workflow. So by adding in the retries, we were able to successfully make this workflow more resilient to transient errors. Now, in this case, I have simulated the error, but you can imagine a network error or the third-party service intermittently going down, etc., which will be automatically fixed on a retry. You don't want the workflow to completely fail for that reason. Now, depending on which kind of service and how you're interacting with it, you can add your transient retries in the error handling. Now you can see all of these states has the error handling and the transient errors and the retry on errors configuration that you can set as required. So if it is a DynamoDB, SQS, etc., you can all update this error handling to have that property and the configuration. Now, when an error happens, the workflow state stops at that point. So for example, in our case, if we move the SQS sending message below our Lambda invoke, so let's drag and down here. Now we have the SQS sent message in here. We can also modify the Lambda invoke to point to SQS message. Instead of go to end, go to SQS send message. So both of these states, regardless of whether we invoke the Lambda or not, is going to go to SQS send state message. Now with this modified state, let's save this and execute, which is going to introduce an error as well. Let's have in another user payload. Here I have the source as invalid. So let's click start execution, which is going to start the workflow. Now it's going to fail in a Lambda step because it is going to throw an exception. But you can see this has errored this whole workflow and it did not send the SQS message. Now in this specific case, depending on your use case, you can either choose to continue or have this workflow state completely terminate. Now this purely comes down to your application scenario and how you need to handle each of these exceptions. Now if we select this, you can see this time this has failed for the invalid user data exception. Now, in this specific case, it is an invalid user data, which means it is not going to fix on a retry. So there's no point adding in a retry for this specific scenario because this is a valid error and this Lambda function does not know how to process this. So let's come back to our workflow and see how we can handle these errors. So let's edit our state machine again. Let's select our Lambda function. Let's go to the error handling and add a new catcher for catching exceptions. So let's add that. Let's enter in a comment which says invalid user data. Now for the errors, we have the error type which is invalid user data exception and let's click enter, which is going to add to the list just like the retries. Now in the fallback state, we can either add a new state or do whatever is required in your application. So in this specific case, let's simply add a new state. So it adds a new flow here and let's navigate and add in a pass state. So let's select this and let's say cannot process this record. Now, if you look at the workflow, in this case, if the fail and it's catching this specific exception, it's going to go to the pass state, put this in the output and go to end. You can also update this to navigate to the SQS, which means it will catch the exception and it will still send the SQS message. Now, this completely depends on your application. So let's click save and let's click execute again. Now let's put in the user information once more with the source as invalid and let's start execution. Now the Lambda function is still going to throw an error, but this time this is going to go to the pass state and end the workflow successfully. So you can see the Lambda invoke has errored and gone to the pass state and gone to navigate. So this time our workflow has exited gracefully and it has handled the exception. Now you can also be editing this state machine to make sure that this sends a message if that is what your use case wants by selecting the pass state and selecting SQS send message, which means regardless of what happens here, it is going to send the message. So now if I save this again and click execute, with the same user data and start execution, you can see once the Lambda function errors, it's gone to the past state and it has still sent the SQS send message. So this time the error is captured and it is still sending the SQS message. So these are the two ways you can handle errors and also exceptions in your workflow. Now, in a future video, I will go into advanced patterns where you can add a global try-catch around your workflow and also capture the messages and send to a dead letter queue so that you can process it later. If you want to be notified when that video comes out, please make sure to hit the subscribe button. It also helps me to grow this YouTube channel. Thank you and see you soon in the next video.